You should be getting the emails that indicate that I record these and I'm posting them. You should have gotten the one. And what I'll do is it takes me roughly an hour and a half to convert the PowerPoint into an MP3 or MP4, which I can then put into YouTube to let them convert it to their format. So I can't do that at class, or it'll be done on the night of class. They'll be posted, so you can always go back and review those. So the big things here again is to make sure you read and pay attention to those case studies that are mentioned throughout. Some of the issues you may have heard of, some of you have not heard of. Kind of a trick point, you'll see at various points I'll give you trivia issues, and those are always interesting for fill-in-the-blank questions. So come in and do that. For those that have had me in the past, the general format of my exams are 15 or so matching, 5 fill-in-the-blank, a couple essays, and a short answer and a couple essays. We'll do that here, and I'm trying to decide how long do you want the test to be? 45 minutes? When I put it together? I mean, so the way I schedule it, I figure it takes X amount of time if you know the answers, X amount of time to do the matching, X amount of time to fill in the blank, and X amount of time to do the essays. And so depending on the length you want to do, it won't necessarily impact the matching and the fill in the blanks, because if you know the material, it shouldn't take you more than 5 minutes to do the matching and the fill in the blank. If you don't, you'll spend hours and never get it figured out. So that most of the time would then be spent on the short answers and the essays. So what it really determines is how many of those short answer and essay questions I put in for you. So if you want like 45 minutes, that'll reduce the number of essays and short answer questions. If you want it longer than that, it'll just be more of those kinds of questions. So I realize I'm being much too small d democratic in letting you have input on these things. But if you have a preference either way, and what that does is that makes a difference on how I present the exam to you. If you want them longer and it'll basically give you the entire class period to do it, then what I'll do is I'll put them online and you can do them remotely and won't need to come into the classroom today. If you want it shorter, we'll do them in class and then still have lecture time to start a new topic. What are your preferences? Pardon me? Okay.
Do people usually struggle with your short answer?
Oh, yeah. I mean, no, people that are not prepared struggle. People that are prepared and they're paid attention in class and listen to right? Is that pretty, you guys have been in my classes, right?
If you listen and you take good notes, then you'll be fine.
Yeah, because I don't do trick questions. I don't put minutia into exams because I want you to learn the basic concepts and ideas behind it. So if you've done the reading and you've kept up with notes in class, and now with all of the PowerPoints also being able to go back and review the audio from it, there should not be. But again, if you're not prepared, doesn't matter how much time I give you, you'll never get it done.
How's 50 minutes?
Want to make 50 minutes? Does that work for everybody? Okay, so I'll plan for 50-minute exams, which will then limit the number, and then that'll give us a bit of time to kind of hit highlights of what's coming up next time. Is that fair? I know I'm much too nice about these things. I should be more rigid and hardcore, right? But you see, again, my bias is that what I want to do in my classes is get you to think about the issues, think about the topics, have broad ideas and concepts. If you're going to go into that field, as a major, then you need to get more of the minutia, and then I can work on that as well. But for most folks, these are general survey classes. You're interested in vocabulary. And the key takeaways is, FEMA is important to know about. The coordination at the state level is important to know about. And this shift from, the national defense being focused to civil defense, and then now on to this collaborative effort that came up. Those are the key concepts to do. And you'll have an opportunity to work all through those with the proposal you're going to put together. I had mentioned the first couple days of class. Do you want me to just assign teams, or is there anybody in particular you want to work with? I'll be more happy to assign teams. You know, it doesn't really matter. And then what that team will be doing is putting together a emergency preparedness plan for an organization. And you will determine whether it's going to be a government organization or a not-for-profit organization or even a private company, because the principles are all the same. And Danelle's not here, but one of the things that she mentioned early in the semester is that she did that this summer on an internship. And what they found out is once the leadership says we want to do it, they put the resources behind it. And what we'll find as we read through, and especially these first 2 chapters, is that one of the shortcomings from a political process is they have short-term memories and they don't want to devote the resources to do it right the first time. So that's one of the big differences. So when you put your proposals together, for just to make it easier to do, you will assume you have no budgetary constraints.
Oh, boy.
Right? So I mean, really go all out for it, because you know, and the issue there is if money was a concern, what would you do? And then from a political perspective, then you take the best of those ideas, or the least expensive, depending on your definition of best, and convert that into a plan. So by creating an environment where you have no monetary constraints, you don't worry about the budget component, and you can just let your imagination go wild. If I had a blank slate and wanted to create a disaster preparedness plan that was really going to work, and then you'll pick your own disaster, and we'll talk about that more as we go on. Okay, but again, no monetary constraints still means regardless of which area you work at, you've got a blank slate to work from. And that'll give you an opportunity to look at, from my bias, a much broader perspective of what's possible and what's doable if you have the money to do it. Make sense? Okay, and we'll chit-chat more about those as we go forward. Assignment for next week, finish reading chapter 2. We'll begin discussing chapter 3. And then our first exam will be at the completion of chapter 4, which will be that first cycle through. Okay. Again, remember from last time, what were the 3 pillars that your author talked about as being critical for understanding emergency management, emergency preparedness, and the evolution?
History, the social science,
Yeah, and those are the 3 pillars that are out there. And so, gee, you might have an opportunity to demonstrate you know that stuff, right? And because those are critical, because what we saw first, I remember we talked last time about the whole process of emergency management, emergency preparedness, and I kind of use those terms interchangeable, as you notice throughout the class, is that it's an evolutionary process. Something happens, we deal with it, and then we do lessons learned from it, and then try to put it in place the next time. So it's continuous improvement, and then it's evolutionary as we go through. And so all these historical examples that they use talk about what we learn from it. And last time we talked about, early, first millennium issues, and now it's a lot of the second. And so the Great Fire of London in 1666, which always reminds me of 1066. Why is the year 1066 important in world history to guys like me? I love this. The Battle of Hastings was fought in 1066. Why do we care about the Battle of Hastings? The Battle of Hastings was the first attempt of the aristocracy to challenge the divine right of kings. Came out as a result of that, which then led to the signing of the Magna Carta 150 years later, which was the foundation of citizen input. Sorry, all this is free stuff. But anyway, 1660, the Great Fire of London, it lasted for 5 days. 426 acres and 90% of the houses were destroyed. Now, compare that to the Caldor Fire in California that's burned how much acreage? Plus 500,000 acres. It's now on the outskirts of Tahoe. in California, massive destruction that's out there. Some 4,000 firefighters are out dealing with it. And the use of new technology, using drones and satellite imagery to track the evolution of the fire. Again, that's that issue that technical expertise and technology makes a difference on how we respond to fires. And one of the things we learned from that was the impact of understanding the long-term impacts of a disaster. And in this case, it was homelessness and starvation. Now, lest we think that's something that happened 400 years ago, what's going on in Louisiana right now? If you followed the news the last couple of days, we talked a good bit about it on Tuesday. What's one of the big issues that's going on in Louisiana right now in the aftermath of Hurricane Ida? What does this say? What's this long term? What were those two things? Homelessness and starvation. Right? Because all those people had their homes destroyed. They're still flooding in a lot of the areas, so they can't get back in even if they want to. And then if you've seen anything in the news, the long lines of people waiting up to get food of any kind, get water, and the electricity, they figure they'll be out for a couple of weeks in most areas because 7 of the 8 power grids going into New Orleans specifically have been, well, all of them were damaged. One of them's been restored, and they're working on the others. But to get areas like Laplace and these smaller rural areas, it's going to take a long time. And so that's one of the elements, if you're taking notes for your presentation in class at the end of the semester, having some consideration of the long-term impacts of disaster is an important element of disaster preparedness. Because as we talked about the 4, and we'll mention those again today, the 4 standard elements in comprehensive and strategic planning is this idea of recovery. And part of recovery goes on. Look at Haiti. How long ago was a major hurricane that went through Haiti? 4 years ago, and they're still recovering from it, and I got hit by another one. Great example of how a community without a lot of capital resources and very ineffective government structures made that darn near impossible. And then as you get in and study it more, they're obviously more interesting. Okay. So one of the things that was interesting is the term fire plug. Do you remember why they called it fire plugs and how that term evolved after the Great Fire of London? No, I mean, it gave a very specific example. If you read it, it should jump out if you read the case study. One of the things they tried to do in the aftermath was make sure they had a water supply. So they took hollowed out logs and buried them throughout the city. And when there was a fire, the fire department would come in and drill down so they could tap into the water supply coming through those hollow tubes. And when they did, they would plug the hole when they were done. And when we get to this issue of curfew, you'll find that related to a fire as well. So these terms that we've got, and that's an example of how so much of our future response is based on past experience. In the bad old days, when I was working in the University of New Orleans, we had mainframes and PCs were just coming along. Okay, and we used mainframes that had 80 columns is all they could display, because and they used to use these data processing punch cards. There were 80 columns, and you'd put a batch of them together and run them through the system. Fine, no big deal. So when they came out with PCs, the early PC limitation was what, 80 columns? Was that because of the technology? No, it was because the mindset was on the way it used to be. The early types of computer programming processing was called batch processing, right? And in batch processing, you would execute one command, then another, then another, then another, and another. Well, that went back to what? When we used punch cards to run them through. So a lot of the early stuff in computer technology was an evolution from mainframe terminology to PC world. And the same you see in emergency response, emergency preparedness. We take a lot of the lessons learned and move those into the new terminology that we move forward with. And so understanding the fire plug is a reminder then that, gee, that you plug the hole you cut into the wood to get a fire system, right? So that becomes an interesting aspect of how words evolve and what they do. So again, it was a 5-day fire. 90% of the houses within the city were destroyed, and the long-term impacts, which we still need to consider today, and look at in California specifically. It's in Canada, and places in Europe are having massive forest fires now. What's the long-term impact, and what is one of the immediate short-term impacts of massive fires? Pardon me? Okay, so we have a drought, which makes it, more fuel to burn, right? But now the fire's gone through, and what are some of the challenges the people have in recovering from the fire? Things are damaged.
I guess, air isn't good.
Air quality, they had a big problem with that right now, and it's in surrounding states that don't have fires. They're dealing with air quality issues.
I guess, I don't know if you count it, but like wildlife displacement.
Wildlife displacement, absolutely. And you have examples, if you watch the news, of bears and stuff trying to find a place to hide in the process of going through that. Homelessness and starvation. Where do these people go back to? And then what happens when it rains after a place has been burned? Floods, mudslides, because there's nothing to hold the soil in place, right? And so see, we don't, and you have to think about those things. In doing your preparedness issue, how do you help, limit those? And I lived in Laguna Beach for several years, and every time it rained, I got mud in my bathroom, right? Because of erosion and those other kind of things go on. So the thing about emergency planning and emergency management that is so critical is spending time thinking about, remember we talked about cascading effects last time? How one thing leads to another thing, leads to another thing. It's kind of just, and you don't have to have, any great disaster experience. Just think about it in your own yard. What happens after you mow the lawn or you clear an area to get ready to plant and a big rainstorm comes, right? We'll put that in the larger scale, those kinds of issues goes on. So that's why it's important to put this in the context. And a lot of it's just common sense. And some of the lessons that we learned from these early, and that's just one example, is that many disasters are preventable, right? And one could argue that a lot of the fire issues going out in California and the West now are preventable. Not the fires so much, but why are we building in fire-prone areas? Why do we bring in non-native species that nature creates a lot of fire-resistant, low stuff, right? We want to come in and make it like it was back home. So it's preventable. To what extent you go and clear the debris and trash around your house and around your yard. And we don't, understand, we should understand that Mother Nature, like in California, the large sequoia trees need fire to reproduce. So it's part of the natural cycle. I was talking to somebody the other day, being in Minnesota, and the prairie grasses. Well, that whole area used to be prairie grasses, and they would use fire to burn it out at the end. So fire is a part of nature, right? It's going to happen all the time. And so the challenge becomes is why do we build in those areas that are prone to that? Look at what's going on in some of the Outer Banks in North Carolina and the barrier islands. Hurricanes come through, the island does what it's designed to do, and yet we encourage the disaster by building in those high-risk areas. So that's one part, just our decisions on where to grow and where to develop. They're also preventable by just using common sense. By understanding the environment in which we live and taking steps to prevent that. There's a place in northwestern Illinois called Galena. Anybody here of Galena, Illinois? It was home to what great president? Ulysses S. Grant, blah, 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 blah. But they, sorry, had to throw that in. But they had massive fires because what were the early houses built from in most of America? Wood, right? So when it burned down, they set a rule in place. Everything had to be built with brick, and use tile and other kind of so when you go through Galena, it's a beautiful little town, but all the buildings are brick because they recover from the fire to deal with those things. So we learn those things. They're preventable if we just, and the challenge always is oftentimes we know what to do, but we don't want to do it. Like when bad weather's coming, how many of you go out in your yard and tie down things you don't want blown? We don't do that. So, and the other one, there's this common thing, well, they're acts of God. There's nothing we could do about it. Well, a volcano exploding, there's not much we can do about, right? But we have now developed the ability to predict, with some degree of certainty. So what do we do in anticipation of it coming through? That's why this notion of acts of God, we have to think about those things. And for those of you that are bored and like stuff to read, there's a wonderful book called Homo Deus. And the basic argument of that book is that humanity has now replaced the need for God, because most of the things that we prayed to God for, we can heal ourselves. Anyway.
How do I spell that?
Homo, Homodeus. So it's like human God. Wonderful book. So this act of God. The other big issue is failure of political officials to act. We've talked about it in several cases. The San Francisco fire of 1906 was a result of government knowing these things and failing to act. The levee system in New Orleans that we talked about Tuesday, they spent $14 billion over 16 years getting back up to standard. There were studies done by LSU in the years right before the hurricane that warned about the weakness of the levee system around New Orleans, and that because it's below sea level, if you didn't do something about it and they were to breach, you would basically have a big soup bowl in what's New Orleans. And if you followed flooding and disasters in eastern North Carolina, what do they raise a lot of in North Carolina, eastern North Carolina specifically? Four-legged creatures with curly tails. Pigs, right? Pigs eat a lot and they eliminate a lot of what they eat. And a lot of that waste is put in lagoons to evaporate and whatnot. When we have a major flood, what happens to the material in those lagoons? They end up in the waterways and the riverways. And human waste, among other things, is a great fertilizer. So then you have growth of algae. Right. So there's that cascading effect. Understanding how things affect everything else is critical. Okay? And this tendency to only plan for the last event. It's like in the military, the argument they're always prepared to fight the last war, not the next one. And part of that is what's known in psychology is the recency effect. We tend to remember those things that happened most recently and plan to prepare for those because we remember how bad it was. And that's great to do those things, but it also limits our ability to look for other potential disasters, other things that come along that get to be important to do. This question again is how soon we forget. Immediately after 9/11, I remember in South Carolina all these people riding around with flags on their cars and all this shows of patriotism, and after a few months there were less and less, and now who does that? We tend to forget, and again that's this notion of the recency effect. Case study 1-1, the Lisbon earthquake of 1755, and when you go back and read that, it was kind of one of the first recorded efforts of a coordinated government relief effort, of getting people together to try to recover from it. So this idea of coordination got to be critical in there. It was a short-term and long-term view of recovery, and this idea of vision. And so one of the things that we always encourage communities, however defined, and organizations, however defined, is what's your vision? What do you want to look like? If you were to leave in 10 years and come back, what would you look like? So the Lisbon earthquake was an example of how prior planning and having a vision for the community drove the Recovery Act and how they came back from it. So it was this idea it was a coordinated effort, but then when they rebuilt it in the image of what their vision was for the community. So, right, so I had these linkages, so you're able to use that disaster to move forward. So again, it's more stuff in there, but it was this idea of a coordinated government relief effort, which took us time to get around to in this country. And short and long-term view, which we have to do, because and understanding cascading and linking into a vision of what's going on. Okay, Texas City disaster. If any of you know what the Texas City disaster was? You might want to go back and make sure you read case study 1-2, which you all should have read before today. What it basically related to was loading of ammunition onto cargo ships. And because of lack of preparedness and following certain safety rules, there was massive explosions. And from a historical point of view, why this is critical is who do you think was given the dangerous task of loading ammunition onto the cargo ships? African Americans, right? So when the disaster happened, it was just one of those combination of things, right? They were concerned about it. They expressed their concern beforehand about the conditions and how things are being done, but nothing was done. And so when the explosion happened, many were lost and injured in the process. So aside from that, one of the big takeaways from this thing was the first lawsuits that were filed claiming government responsibility. And as you might expect, this case of Elizabeth Dalhite versus United States was a claim that said we deserve some compensation because the accident was preventable had the government taken the warnings ahead of time and done something about it. Well, the problem is the lower court ruled, and it was upheld by the Supreme Court, that acts of commission or omission were discretionary. So you can't hold people accountable for making a discretionary decision. And so what it ended up doing is not helping the folks that were injured or killed in the explosion, but it basically set the precedent that officials are absolved from any personal liability for the results of their actions. Okay. In today's environment, that has been somewhat adjusted. And now it's under the broad heading is if you are operating within your official duties and following the law, then you're not personally responsible. If, however, you have some malfeasance in office or following a personal agenda that can be proved, you had a vested interest in what was happening, then you can be sued. But basically, if I'm just doing my job and I know these issues are going on and I decide to ignore them, that's a discretionary decision and I can't be held accountable for it. So again, we knew it was there. There was sufficient evidence ahead of time that a disaster was altogether likely to happen. Those things were ignored. You had loss of life when the lawsuit was filed. And again, the first lawsuit, claiming government failure to act was basically ended up decided in favor of government. That these acts were required to do, as long as I wasn't doing something illegal in the process, I'm protected against personal liability. And so the government and the community. What you see that's evolved from that is now, what does government do when a disaster happens? They often jump in and do compensation. And in recent times, one of the best examples is the compensation plan put together after the towers came down. And there was a big government effort to compensate the victims of that disaster. Okay, read through, pay particular attention. There's so much in there, I'm not going to go through all of it. But the basics is from 17 to 22. It talks about linkages in history, in historical documents, legislations that were passed, acts of Congress that were passed, that link government to the recovery role in disaster response. And again, there's nothing in there of particular note that I'm going to ask you about a specific. What you need to be able to do by reading through that is understand that there were a variety of acts that were passed that dealt with the government's role and how that impacted. There are also several examples in there that establish the precedent of some government liability for economic damages resulting from disaster. And like everything else, what you'll find as you go back and read those sections, it started out very small and very specific, and then now is much more general. And again, paying particular attention to that, there's nothing in specific. I'm going to ask you about that, right? On page 18 it said, who cares? But it's understanding that evolutionary flow that's in there. Does that help? So go back and read that, so that'll work out just fine. And then what we've had is what we call the creation of this disaster bureaucracy. I mean, as you go back and read, bureaucracy is just the government's way of handling big issues. And for those of you that are interested in the public not-for-profit management major we've got now, there's a wonderful book called The Cunning of History. It's a very short book. It deals with bureaucracy. And part of the argument, although not the complete argument, part of the argument is that the German Holocaust was in part possible because of the effectiveness of the German bureaucracy. By claiming or deciding that Jews were not citizens, they were not considered eligible for the protections of citizenship, and therefore you were just filling quotas. And that idea of citizenship bringing its special responsibilities and privileges is not unique to that time frame. Go back to the Roman Empire. And citizens of Rome had great freedom and flexibility that were not given to folks that were not citizens of Rome. But in this case, the bureaucracy. And so what that should let you know is that bureaucracies can be great things because of simplified decision rules, but red tape, getting mired down, that's what this is talking about. You get bureaucratic debates. Organizations are more interested in protecting their own turf than in looking at the overall good that's being done. And we see that in a lot of cases where, and my line is when the elephants dance, it's the ants that get squashed. When the people supposed to be making decisions, they fight their battles out, and it's the citizens that get damaged in the process. And that's what this talks about, is the growth of the bureaucracy. And it shifted from military to civilian leadership. And in the early 19th century, early 20th century, the U.S. government had that, and specifically the U.S. Army. And as you go back and read through the text, it gives several examples, and one of the reasons was it had the size, it had the efficiency, it had the bureaucracy, it had the supply chains. It had all those things that were not that prevalent in the public sector at the time and within government itself. But the Army, they had to move troops. They had to have resources available. So up until the early part of the 20th century, the Army had responsibility for things. And then back to this notion of government giving economic recovery monies was this notion of tendency for targeted recovery. Again, we have a disaster and we need to help those folks out. But as you would suggest, politics became so that what started out as a targeted response ended up going to anybody and everybody involved. So the War of 1812 and compensation for that war was originally intended to compensate people who suffered losses in the War of 1812. And then by the time it was done, anybody who had anything that happened during that time frame was eligible for it, rather than those simply affected. The Freedmen's Bureau was the same way. It was supposed to compensate slaves and whatnot coming out to help them get established. And then it got expanded. But it's much like in South Carolina, the way that happens. One of the ways they wanted to encourage people to get into teaching was to allow, if you taught at high need to high risk schools for a period of time, they would help pay off your student loans. But by the time it got through the political process, just about every school district in the state was eligible for it. So this fact that we start out with these targeted attempts to address issues, and the politics of the process expands it to such point that because you still have that fixed amount of money, the more people who get part of the distribution means overall most people get more or less money. Less. Yeah, the more you expand the pool of people eligible, the less direct assistance is available to those folks directly impacted by the disaster recovery. And so that's what these examples talk about, is this role of bureaucracy. And once you get bureaucracy involved, then you're going to have those issues come up because of the politics of it. That gets to be important. The American Red Cross, and you hear about them all the time. And one of the things, if you've been following the news with all the disasters and issues we've been dealt with, they've been stretched awful thin and are always looking for more volunteers to help go and work. And this is an example of what we showed in the video the very first day about how now disaster recovery has to be a collaborative activity because the government does not have the expertise in all the specific areas needed. And one of the two examples we used on Tuesday of private citizens assisting in a recovery effort from a coordinated perspective.
Cajun Army
Cajun Navy.
or Navy.
Team Rubicon, which is military veterans that get together to do that. So these are folks with technical expertise from years of doing these things, and rather than being lone wolves, they do what? We talked about them embedding their representatives within the disaster recovery plan completely. So again, this notion that government, and so what we had with the Red Cross is this evolution of private getting involved in the recovery and disaster response aspect of things. And you have that still to this day. When there's a big fire in an apartment complex, who do you see on the news providing blankets and temporary housing folks? The Red Cross. So all of those things come in. And so this, again, the key takeaway is as part of this evolution that's taking place now within emergency preparedness is the key term collaboration. The understanding that the government doesn't have all of the resources, not so much the money, but technical expertise to deal with all these things. They don't have the ability to mobilize as quickly. So using non-governmental actors in a collaborative effort is the new model for disaster recovery in this country. Important takeaway from that. And so it was founded on 21 May 1881. And these are some examples your text talks about where they got actively involved. And as most things happen, have you taken constitutional law classes? Taken a class in constitutional law? You know, one of the things your takeaways should have been from there is the evolutionary nature of a lot of the Supreme Court decisions. And the best example is Brown versus Board of Education. There were a series of smaller cases beforehand that set precedent that was then used in that ruling. And so this is an example of an evolutionary process at work where the Red Cross, being relatively new, stepped in to help out in these early issues, the Great Thumb, Johnstown flood, and Galveston hurricane, and the Spanish-American War. Your book goes into more detail on those things. So that by 1900, and then again in 1905, they were chartered by the government to provide disaster relief. So again, they started out small, did well, and then the government said, gee, you've got resources that we don't have. And so 120 years ago, they were first chartered to help have that role. You see that now all the time, where some of the first teams on site are American Red Cross, and they're volunteers. And any of you who want to get involved in disaster preparedness or disaster response, Red Cross, among other organizations, is always looking for volunteers, and they provide extensive training for those things. For those of you involved in churches or civic groups, you'll also see a lot of churches and civic groups put together teams, right? To go into areas to help people recover. Again, this coordinated effort that moves forward. So what you see, and this will continue on in a little bit more, is this notion of the evolutionary nature of it, looking for best practices, continuous improvement. And here at Red Cross, over the period of 20 years, proved its value and worth, right? To the point that what? The government decided to include them in the process and give them a formal role. And by giving them a formal role, they then had access to what? Money and resources of the federal government. Important aspect. The Mississippi flood of 1927, case study 1-3. And this is notable for several things that were either immediately or within the short term after that. And your text makes a point that this was the first recorded effort of a coordinated federal response. And who was the president in 1927?
Coolidge.
Hmm?
Alvin Coolidge.
Wasn't it Hoover?
Coolidge.
Oh, you think Coolidge? I think it was Hoover, but we'll check. Herbert Hoover. We'll find out. Huh? Yeah. And what was interesting as you go back and read is that, again, I think it was Hoover, but it was Coolidge. Well, there you go. Life is good. That's why I love the internet's good stuff. But again, the issue that's here and that president, what they brought to the table was they had prior experience in dealing with disasters in other areas. So good to keep me on my toes. Good job. So it was a coordinated effort. They got the Department of War, Secretaries of War, Navy, Treasury, and Agriculture, and they were directed to coordinate with the Red Cross. So there was a coordinated response, and this is kind of that first. And then within 10 years of that, and now some 50 years after the creation of the Red Cross, the Army finally acknowledged primary responsibility for disaster relief was now with the Red Cross. So that shift from military to combinations of civilians and coordinated efforts. And that's the key takeaway from keep cool with Cal, right? To move on from there. Interesting aspect that goes on. But what your text also makes the point of saying is that it also reinforced the military's role. And that the Red Cross, although they could be active in the process, they had no control over the military. The military was still going to do its own thing. But again, this evolution to this idea of non-federal involvement. Additional civil defense and FEMA are two big ones to take away from the last part of that chapter. Drop, duck, and cover civil defense was very active after World War II in Korea when they were concerned about nuclear weapons and things of that nature. So you had civil defense evacuation areas and warnings, and now it's evolved to a much larger aspect. And FEMA is a word we hear all the time, and you'll also see as you read through the text this evolution of FEMA and the impact of Hurricane Katrina on FEMA, and this understanding that the director of FEMA needed to have not only political and managerial expertise, but also had to have some disaster experience to move through to do that. And figure 1.10 shows that disaster response cycle that we talked about the other day. This idea of response, recovery, mitigation, preparedness, and it's a cyclical nature. And they've got kind of the beginning point being the disaster, the before and after. So you have the disaster, immediately you have your disaster response, you then move into recovery, and then mitigation, then you get prepared for the next. But these are not necessarily discrete or unique acts. They're done in combination for a variety of reasons as we move forward. Okay. And one of the big highlights in Chapter 2 is this dialogue, debate, conflict, whatever term you need to think about in terms of terror versus natural disaster. Okay. We're coming up on the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And a major awakening of what we needed to do and how we needed to deal with things. Because it was always there, but it really put it front and center, this idea of potential for terrorist attack and the need to be prepared for those things. And so early on, there was a debate which was more important, responding to terrorism or spending time on disaster recovery and preparedness. And what you see as you read through that is this idea of the massive amounts of money coming in and how that affected predominantly law enforcement. But what it didn't take into account necessarily are pre-existing conditions within those communities that may have limited the effectiveness. And one of the great examples the text talks about, and we'll get to that, I think, in the next slide or so, is the ongoing conflict specifically in New York between the fire and the police department that predated 9/11. Okay. Coordinated efforts began as early as the 1980s to do those. We were concerned about these things. Remember last time we talked about focusing events? Remember what a focusing event was all about? It grabs your attention, which then translates into what? It also grabs the attention of who? Not just the average citizen, but the government, the politicians. And it's considered a focusing event because it's something you remember, it's something people are aware of, which then prompts government to do what? Act, yeah. Focusing events is that where they realize that part of the issue may be the result of policy failures on the part of government. So it's that focusing event because it calls everybody's attention to it, and because of the attention that's drawn to it, it then has an impact on the elected officials, the policymakers, that perhaps we need to look at some kind of policy to deal with those things. So this they talk about in the beginning of chapter 2, is this emphasis on this notion of focusing events. And as I've said several times, as you read through chapter 2, again, full of acronyms and all those kind of things, pay attention to this evolutionary nature of emergency preparedness. We do stuff, we see how it works, and again, as I've said several times, that happens in everyday life. If you're on a sports team, you have a plan, and you go into the game, right? And if the game works out just fine, you still go back to learn lessons learned, and then you prepare to play last week's opponent or next week's opponent. Next week's opponent. That game is over. So you see what you did right, you see what you do wrong, and you make adjustments, understanding what the strengths and weaknesses of your new opponent are. And so in disaster preparedness and emergency management, it's that same notion. You prepared for a disaster, you put steps in place that you think will be the best way to deal with it, and then you see how it worked out in real life, and then you make adjustments as necessary. And the challenge that's being reinforced throughout this part of the text is this idea that we're too often prepared for the last disaster, not the next one. We don't kind of think outside the box in dealing with these things. And from a psychology point of view and a biology point of view, we are what's known as self-organizing systems. We tend to look for patterns and routines. And once we get those patterns and routines, it's difficult for us to change unless some big event happens. And so, again, as you read through chapter 2, the key comes out of here is this idea of the evolutionary nature, things that happened and how we tried new things and then they evolved and evolved and evolved. And that's going to continue after Ida. And again, we all know that Louisiana was the only area impacted by Ida, right? Huh? The big answer is no. What was happening in New England yesterday? Tornadoes, massive rain, as that low system went on. So that went all the way from the Gulf and Louisiana all the way up through Washington and New York and New England areas. So again, they should have been prepared because they had enough advance warning of what was going on. And so we'll see over the next several days what kind of that response was as we move forward. So this idea of evolution of learning. And if you see it going on one way, what can I do in my community? And I use example the first day or two that is an example of this. There's a colleague of mine used to be the city manager or the town manager for Hilton Head. And they sent folks down to respond to a hurricane, and they couldn't get in because they didn't have the correct paperwork or whatever that the area required. So they were turned around and sent back home. And so what he did was he got his folks together from an emergency preparedness perspective and said, let's go through our programs, our plans, our policies, and see if we have anything in place that makes it more difficult for people to help out, and then adjust our plan accordingly. So again, learning, and even if, in that case, they couldn't even get in to help out, but they took that as a lesson learned. Let's go back and make sure we don't have those things in place in the process. So it's always. National Plan for Emergency Preparedness in 1964 was one of the earliest efforts for some overarching coordinated response, but it focused on national defense. The Plan for Federal Response to Catastrophic Earthquake in 1987 was the first true national response plan. Why? Because it looked at non-military, right, non-national defense issues to get into this idea of natural disasters, man-made disasters to move on. So that's why it was the first true national plan. What's interesting about it is that there was no boilerplate for them to follow. There was nothing else, kind of like what you're going to put together in class, right? You'll have a bit of a boilerplate, but not much, because it's going to be wide open to you because I've taken out money as a concern. So given a blank slate, and so what you find out is because there was no previous, they had a blank slate to work with and figured what would be the best way to do it. And that's what's important out of here. And they emphasize this idea of decentralized response. What does that mean, decentralized response? Yeah, but it's more this idea you want to have a decentralized response but still coordinated. You don't want people just showing up to help out. You want to have some control and some effort over that. But understanding that emergency response begins at the local level and ends at the local level. And there are stages to go through. The city or county contacts the state, who then requests the declaration of emergency from the national government, which then makes resources available for them to go back and do it. But this idea, it's not all one place. You don't have to wait for a bureaucrat in Washington to say this is a disaster. You don't have to wait for money from Washington to start your recovery. So rather than it being all in one place, it's back to what we saw in the video, you have decentralized. Each area, depending on their proximity to the disaster, has responsibilities. And those responsibilities are either immediate response, the first 24, 48 hours, or built to the larger scale. That help out? And so again, it's this notion that one size doesn't fit all, and that's what came across in these early efforts at emergency preparedness plans, was this idea that one size doesn't fit all. This idea that we need to have some local input, local involvement. And again, we'll see here in a couple more slides, this notion that if you don't take into account local culture and local community, you're going to be tough to get in. I love one of my favorite jokes is the guy's farmer's in the house and there's a knock on the door. And he opens the door and there's a fellow out there that shows him his badge and says, "I'm from the government, I'm here to count your cows." And the guy says, "Yeah, but I don't get any government money. I don't care, I'm from the government, I'm here to count your cows." "But I'm from the government, I'm here to count your cows." So the guy says, "Okay, go count your cows." And a few minutes later, here is this, "Help, help," coming off in the distance. He looks outside and the bull has got the government man up in a tree. And the guy's yelling, "Help, help," and the farmer yells back, "Show him your badge." Right? This notion of I'm from the government, I'm here to help, isn't necessarily what we're looking for. So by having this decentralized effort, this collaborative effort, I take those things into consideration. Okay, does that help? I love that little story. Show them your badge. It gets to be an important aspect of who and what we do and what we are. And then, beginning in the late 19th, 20th century, we had this growing conflict between national security and natural hazards. Who's going to take precedent? And in some ways, it's almost back to what the Army was fighting with the Red Cross. 60 years earlier. Who's in charge? Who's running the show? And what's important here is a federal response plan of 1992 shifted from event-specific planning. What is event-specific planning, just from the terms? Exactly, right? It's planning for specific events. So our plan is for a hurricane, our plan is for a tornado, our plan is for a fire, right? And so what they were trying to do at that point is put some broader cover around it, rather than having a plan designed simply for this event and another one for this event, and another for this event. There should be some general principles that apply regardless of what the disaster is. You know, you need to worry about how do we recover from it. You need to have groups in place to help respond to whatever that disaster is. If it's fire, you need one type of skill set. If it's flood, you need another type of skill set. If it's building destruction, you need another type of skill set. So it's this idea that there are some general principles or general practices that apply to emergency planning, emergency management, that don't depend on what the event is. So rather than having specific plans for every possible event, they started putting in general guidelines that could be followed, and then you could augment as much as possible. Hurricane Andrew in 1992 changed. And FEMA, again, is one of those things that look through, because FEMA is still around today. And so as you go through the reading and take your notes, pay attention to the evolution of FEMA, because again, you'll have an opportunity to demonstrate you understand how it's evolved since its creation. Okay. And so one of the things Hurricane Andrew did is, before that time, FEMA kind of was seen as kind of a third-party involvement. They just kind of sat back and did stuff. And this said, no, we need to have some coordinated effort, and the federal government is the one best able to do that. So it highlighted the role of FEMA. And this idea of centralized, there was a study done of one of the disasters, the Challenger space shuttle, that blew up because of cold weather on an O-ring around one of the seals. And one of the studies that we looked at it said that they didn't want to overemphasize it, but you had to understand that decentralization of decision making, right? Putting it down to the lowest level is a good thing. But there was no centralized effort to look, so that if the O-ring folks weren't talking to the weather folks, their O-ring stuff would be great and the weather stuff would be great, but there's nobody linking those two things together. So what this is saying, we needed to have centralized efforts to address concerns, right? Not to do the action, but to have overall, let's look and make sure we're doing things in the proper way to make them happen, to make sure all the elements work together. You know, and that's all, you know, that's like on any sports team. What sport do you play?
Not here, I don't play anything, but baseball.
Baseball. And everybody has a role to play, but the coach is kind of the centralizing from football, right? Everybody has a role to play. What sport are you in? Track, okay. You have, everybody has their own things that they do, right? But then the coaching and the training staff is kind of the coordinators for it, right? So this is, again, you know, this isn't magic stuff that just comes from nowhere. It happens in all aspects of life. Everybody has their own unique responsibilities, but there's somebody there coaching, guiding to go through. And so that's what came out of Hurricane Andrew in 1992, is the importance of having some centralized oversight, but not centralized control and command of everything that goes on. Make sense?
So they wouldn't get blamed for anything.
Pardon me?
So they wouldn't get blamed for anything.
Well,
So, I mean, like, I guess if you oversee it, you do have some responsibility.
you have a responsibility for making sure that the people are talking to each other. And where you'll get blamed is if you create an environment where you wait for stuff to happen and react rather than play an active role in the planning part of it. And as we've seen, this idea of collaboration is key in getting all the players at the table. If you've ever seen any news reports from the South Carolina's Emergency Preparedness Office during disasters, they've got a number of people that represent the county, represent the municipality, represent the Red Cross, represent the National Guard, represent South Carolina for law enforcement. And so they've got this coordinated effort. Somebody centralized helping everybody out, but it's more from a directive point of view. You need to go this, go there, rather than do these specific things, because you'll get there on the ground to see what needs to be done. So I don't know necessarily that I would say it's a way to avoid blame, because whatever happens, somebody's getting blamed for it. But it's more this understanding that it's great having everybody having their own roles, but if somebody's not got centralized oversight, it'll be, you know, a cluster. That makes you up, okay? So again, those are some, again, we've learned those things, and that over time, and you see now, and again, the current issue going on in Louisiana is you see a variety of different organizations working together with somebody centralized helping to guide and direct. It's almost in some ways like having a drone overseeing everything that's going on, and being able to say, you need to go here, you need to go there, you need to do that, rather than, specifics. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah. And then 9/11 happened, and it really had a big impact on what we looked at from disasters, and it changed our focus. It was the first time we seriously talked about homeland security and the amount of funds going to that. It really put our focus on terrorism. And look at all the millions and billions of dollars that have been spent in the last 20 years on terrorism issues. Yes, sir.
Wasn't the actual Homeland Security Department founded because of 9/11?
It rose to prominence. There was an issue there. The Stafford Act in February included terrorism and started talking about those things. But Homeland Security and then being elevated to a cabinet level happened after 9/11. As the world changed and there was more folks involved in terrorism. And so you have examples of major cities having massive resources spent. And the great example is New York City. If you ever see any events and they interview their stuff and getting ready for New Year's Eve and all those kind of things, the way those all efforts get coordinated on how to plan to deal with those things. The Stafford Act, which you'll see various times as we go through, deals with this idea of disasters and emergency response, and in February of that year it included terrorism. And one of the big takeaways from 9/11, as you would greatly expect, there was a shift of concern from natural hazards to terrorism, and at the state and local level. Because most local communities didn't think much about terrorism. It's something that happens elsewhere. And it really shifted the focus, and that then shifted the funding, shifted the priorities and whatnot that have moved on. So a seminal event that happened in this role of national security and dealing with those issues and the impact that had on emergency preparedness. Because again, part of terrorism is what? Prevention, which you do with, you try to do that. We talked about that as one of the cycles of emergency response. But also then how do you respond and react to it? And that's why that has to be coordinated. But it's just a shift in focus and where money's spent. And you're going to move it down to the local level. Again, shifting national security focus from emergency preparedness to terrorism. The amount of money that was spent was massive, and anytime there's a lot of money spent, there's always going to be a percentage that's going to be misspent and misdirected. Focused on short-term rather than long-term impacts of the events. And one of the things that we learned from history is you've got to look at the long-term impacts as part of your recovery. There's immediate events. So like the COVID issue, what can be some of the possible long-term impacts of COVID and our response to it?
I guess like a recurrence, a relapse of it.
It could be a relapse.
I guess, right.
But at an individual level, what are some of the long-term impacts going to be from COVID? What's one of the reasons that there's so much clamoring to get people back in school, face-to-face instruction? Socialization. And the Department of Education just came out and studied, talked about the decline in educational achievement over the last year. So does that put all those kids back? Right? The reports, if you've read around about the psychological impacts, not only from a socialization point of view, but just the idea of being isolated, being removed from folks. And then there's also what they're finding now, more and more health-related concerns that'll be long-term. So this notion is part of your planning has to be for the long term as we go forward. And they were more focused on short term, let's get this done, but no impact on, no concern about the long-term impact. And what's another example of how that's worked out that's still going on today? Directly related to 9/11 and the collapse of the World Trade Towers. Nope, more fun, yeah, but that's part of it, but from a long-term impact.
TSA, airport.
Okay, that happened, but move it down to a very personal level, an individual level. was one of the ways they helped recover and search for bodies after the collapse of the buildings? Just happened just recently in Florida when that condominium complex collapsed.
Like dogs.
Hmm?
Like you know, like rescue dogs and whatnot.
But look at the human perspective, human responses. So you had all these people out there, and we learned some lessons, but in that area, without proper masks, in a very contaminated area, with all the asbestos and things in the air, the chemicals, the fuel from the planes, there was bad weather from the fires. And what we didn't look at that time was the long-term impact on the health of the people who were first responders. And it's just within the last couple of years that Congress has actually taken action to help provide money to give health care to these folks. Right? We looked at the immediate response, let's get it done and find the people and deal with it. But what's the impact on the first responders, long-term health? And you'll see that again because one of the things that if you watch the coverage from Florida that was more prevalent there than with the towers is they had water cannons around spraying water to keep the dust down, to try to keep the particles down. They had respirators, they limited the amount of time people were in and out of the area, right? And that's a long-term impact that we don't oftentimes think about. So we learned that lesson from 9/11 with the long-term health. The number of people that have died after 9/11 who were first responders that dealt with health issues, specifically different kinds of cancers, that can be directly related to the contaminated environment with the response. And so what you have to do is balance the health of the first responders against doing the recovery. And that's what this is talking about, short-term rather than long-term. And it took years of fighting for the first responders from 9/11 to get health care directly related to health issues that were the result of being on the piles and moving the rubble out. Okay, and this last is it's often fail to understand local government organizations and structures. You can put all of the high-tech communication devices in the world, but if firemen and police officers don't talk to each other on a daily basis, how's that going to change just by having new equipment? You've got to change the culture. And that's one of the things that they learned as a result of this. You can spend all the money in the world, but if there's natural animosity between people or groups, or who wants to take credit determines how much involvement they want to have, right? And that's one thing you deal with sports. I mean, to what extent is it a personal game, or to what extent is it a team game? Right? And one of the things that can make a team with good players and a few stars unsuccessful is if those with the superior talent don't realize they're part of a team and want to showboat in the process. I mean, a good running back relies on a quarterback being able to handle the exchange, requires on the front line, right, to be able to do the blocking assignments in addition to their skill. So if they all do their job, it's good for the running back or the receiver or whoever to really shine, but they shine because of the result of the work of other folks. And if you keep that all in context, you get a lot more successful than if you make it all about me. For sports, is that pretty much a fair way to look at things? And that's what this is talking about. You got to understand the culture and the important role that everybody plays in the process. Pretty exciting, eh? So again, what I would encourage you to do is, at a minimum, glance over the books before we do it, so you have some familiarity with the issues, and then go back and reread and focus on things we highlighted here in class. I mean, if I were studying that story, I would do it because, as you know, I like to ask questions and get your input on what you thought about the readings. So at least go through and glean and do some skimming. And in your study, make sure to pay attention to those case studies they mentioned because that'll have a lot of additional information that will be helpful in answering test questions. How's that for being nice to you guys? Okay? Well, have a good weekend. If you need me, beep me. I'll get this converted and posted later tonight unless you need to go back and review it. So